She was accused of murder in front of an entire kingdom, and the man who condemned her didn't even let her finish a sentence. One night, one lie, one king who chose rage over truth, and just like that, the woman who loved him more than her own breath was thrown into a frozen wilderness to die alone. But here's what that king never calculated. Some wolves don't die when you exile them. Some wolves evolve. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. Let me know where in the world you're watching this pack grow. The blood moon had been rising for 3 hours before anyone inside Shadowfang's Great Hall noticed that Elira Vale was the only one not celebrating. She stood at the eastern edge of the ceremonial floor, spine straight, hands folded at her waist in the posture she'd spent 11 years perfecting. The posture of a Luna who understood that every breath she drew in public was a political act. Around her, the kingdom's finest had gathered in their war silks and bone jewelry, silver torches burning in iron brackets along the obsidian walls, the whole hall reeking of pine resin and aged blood wine. The blood moon ceremony was the most sacred gathering in the Shadowfang calendar. One night each year, when the wolf world paused its brutality and pretended convincingly to be civilized. Elira had hosted 14 of these ceremonies. She had chosen every flower arrangement currently dying beautifully in the iron vases along the west corridor. She had approved the boar selections, the wine pours, the order of the elder blessings. She had spent 3 days on her feet coordinating every detail of this night, because that was what a Luna did. She held the kingdom's dignity in her 2 hands and refused to let it drop, no matter how heavy it got. She scanned the crowd now with the practiced calm of someone who had learned early that watching was more valuable than talking. Lord Fenwick was deep in conversation with 2 border commanders near the fire basin, his thick jaw working around words that had the shape of trade negotiations, but the cadence of threats. The Elder Council sat in their carved chairs along the northern wall, 7 old wolves whose collective silence carried more authority than anything Fenwick would ever say. Lady Marin of the Crestfall pack was 3 cups deep into the blood wine and growing dangerously warm-eyed near a young warrior who clearly hadn't slept in days. Normal. All of it normal. Elira exhaled slowly through her nose, then she felt it, the particular quality of stillness that moves through a room when something has already gone wrong and the air knows before the people do. Her eyes found Kael. He stood at the high table on the ceremonial dais, and he was not looking at her. He was staring at the arched entrance to the hall with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not in 11 years of marriage, not through wars or losses or the long, brutal winters that had tested every seam of their bond. His jaw was set so hard the muscle in his cheek was visibly jumping. His hands, usually loose at his sides or wrapped around a cup, were balled into fists against his thighs. He knew something. Whatever it was eating him alive. Elira took 1 step forward, instinct pulling her toward him the way it always had. That bone-deep pull of a mated pair that had nothing to do with choice and everything to do with the wolf beneath the skin. She knew his silences better than most people knew conversation. She could read the specific language of his anger. The cold kind, the hot kind, the kind that came from fear wearing fury's face. This was something else. This was the look of a man standing at the edge of a decision he had already made and hated himself for. She never reached him. The doors at the far end of the hall opened and Seraphine walked in. She came in slowly. That was the first wrong thing. Seraphine moved through rooms the way hawks descended, clean and direct and never unsure of where she was going. But tonight she walked with small, deliberate steps, one hand pressed flat against her abdomen, the other reaching out to grip the arm of her personal attendant. Her dark hair was loose, which was unusual for ceremony. Her dress, a deep scarlet, almost insulting in its choice of color on this particular night, was fitted in a way that drew every eye to the hand resting against her stomach. Elira stopped walking. The hall didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet in a wave, starting near the door and spreading outward as people turned, saw Seraphine, saw her face, saw her hand, and understood, or thought they understood, what they were looking at. Seraphine's attendant guided her to the center of the floor, not the edges, not the walls where guests stood and observed, the center, where ceremonies happened, where declarations were made, where the pack bore witness. Elira felt the cold start at the base of her skull and work downward. "She's going to speak," she thought, and the thought arrived with a certainty so absolute it felt like memory. Seraphine raised her chin. Her dark eyes swept the hall, over the lords, over the elders, over the warriors, and finally found Kael on the dais. Something passed between them, something Alira had never seen before and couldn't name. Then Seraphine's knees buckled. It was theatrical enough to be suspicious and genuine enough to be devastating. She went down slowly, catching herself on one knee, her attendant crying out and grabbing her shoulders. The crowd surged forward. People were shouting for healers. Lord Fenwick's voice boomed over the chaos, demanding someone clear the floor. Alira was already moving. Not because she trusted Seraphine, not because the instinct that had lived in her chest since childhood, the one that could distinguish real pain from performed pain, was convinced. She moved because standing still while someone collapsed in front of her was not something her body was capable of doing, and she was already halfway across the floor before her mind caught up with her feet. She didn't make it. Kael came off the dais like he'd been launched from a crossbow. He crossed the floor in 8 strides and dropped to one knee beside Seraphine, both hands catching her face, his voice low and rapid, and something that Alira, who had never once heard Kael Thorne speak to any woman the way he'd spoken to her, processed as profoundly intimate. She stopped, 10 feet away, close enough to hear everything, far enough that no one was looking at her yet. "I have you," Kael was saying. "I have you, look at me." Seraphine's hands found his wrists. Her breathing was ragged, staged just right, not too theatrical, not too calm. "I tried to stay quiet," she gasped. I didn't want to ruin the ceremony." "You're not ruining anything. Look at me. The child." The word detonated in the hall like a stone dropped into still water. Alira watched the ripple move outward in real time. The elder council straightened in their chairs. Lord Fenwick went very still. 3 noble women near the fire basin grabbed each other's arms. A warrior near the back wall actually took a step forward before catching himself. Kael's face changed, something soft and something savage colliding in real time across his features. "What about the child?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but the hall was quiet enough now that it carried to every corner. Seraphine's hand pressed harder against her abdomen. "She knew," she breathed. "She found out, and the tea she sent this morning, I should have known. I should have—" She broke off into a cough that shook her whole body, and the attendant at her side wept with convincing desperation. "I felt the burning start an hour ago. I waited. I thought it would pass. But the child—" "Who sent you tea this morning?" Kael's voice had changed. It was flat now. It was the voice he used right before battle. Not angry, not loud, just stripped of everything that made it human. Seraphine closed her eyes. A single tear tracked down the left side of her face with absolutely perfect timing. "My king, I don't want to say it. She is your Luna." "Who?" The pause stretched for 3 full seconds. "Alira," Seraphine whispered. Alira heard her own name in that hall and felt nothing for exactly 1 heartbeat. The brief, merciful pause of a body absorbing something too large for immediate processing. Then every head in the room turned toward her, and it all arrived at once. The accusation, the crowd. Kael, still on his knee, now looking up with those pale gray eyes she had loved for 11 years, finding her face with an expression she had never seen directed at her before. Doubt. Not question. Not inquiry. Not the open uncertainty of a man who needed more information. Doubt in the specific shape of a man who had already started to believe. Alira's voice came out steady. She didn't plan for it to be steady. It simply was, because her body had survived enough hard things that it had learned to stop shaking during the moments that mattered. "That is a lie." The room didn't breathe. Kael rose slowly to his feet. He was 6 feet 4 inches of pure muscle and iron discipline, and standing at his full height with the silver torchlight catching the angles of his face, he looked exactly like what he was, the Alpha King of the most powerful wolf territory in the Southern Realm. He had killed 37 men in single combat. He had broken a siege that lasted 9 months through sheer refusal to yield. He had, once, sat beside Alira through 3 days of fever when she was sick enough to be frightened and held her hand without sleeping. He walked toward her slowly. "When did you send her tea?" he said. Not a question, a recitation, like he was reading the charges off a list he'd already memorized. Elira kept her eyes on his. I have sent no tea to Seraphine. I have sent no tea to anyone today. I have been in the preparation room since this morning overseeing the ceremony that your kingdom expects every year. Any servant who was in those rooms can confirm servants lie when they're afraid of the woman giving orders. The insult landed across the hall like a physical thing. Elira heard at least 3 sharp intakes of breath. Say what you mean, Kael. I think I'm being very clear. You are not. She kept her voice level because allowing it to rise would look like guilt to an audience already primed to see guilt. You are standing in front of your entire court, accepting an accusation as fact without a single piece of evidence, from a woman who has wanted my position since the day she arrived in this kingdom, and you are doing it because she said the word child, and it made you forget that you have known me for 11 years. Something moved behind his eyes, the faintest crack in the stone. She saw it, and pushed. I am your Luna. I have served this kingdom, this court, and you with everything I am. I have not harmed her. I have not harmed her child if there is one. I am asking you as your mate, to hear me. The silence held for a moment that felt long enough to change things. Then Seraphine made a sound from the floor, low, involuntary, the kind of sound that bypasses all performance and lands in the gut. Kael's eyes left Elira's face. She lost him in that exact instant. She would replay it for the rest of her life and never find the moment where she could have caught him. That single second when his attention moved from her face to the woman on the floor, and the doubt finished hardening into something she couldn't reach anymore. Get the healers, Kael said to someone behind him. His voice returned to that flat battlefield register. Then he turned back to Elira, and what was left on his face was not anger. Anger she could have worked with. Anger meant he was still fighting her. This was something worse. This was the face of a man who had made peace with what he was about to do. Elira Vale. The use of her full name, without title, was the first blow. She had heard men stripped of their names in this hall before. She had stood beside Kael while he did it. 3 warriors, 2 lords, 1 treasonous advisor. She knew the protocol, the way she knew the ceremony arrangements. She knew what came next. She breathed in through her nose. The air tasted like pine smoke and spilled blood wine and the specific metallic quality of humiliation. Don't, she said quietly. Just to him, just between them, for whatever it was worth. His jaw tightened. Don't do this, she said again, and her voice broke on the second word, a single fracture that she couldn't prevent and hated herself for. Not here, not like this. If you have doubts about me, bring them to the council chamber. Bring them to the elders. Let me answer them properly. You owe me that much. I owe you an investigation, Kael said, but I owe my heir protection first. There is no heir, or if there is, it is not mine to harm. I want nothing to do with that woman. Then why is she on my floor in pain? I don't know, Elira said, and she heard how it sounded. She heard the way the truth always sounded worse than a well-constructed lie. In the moments immediately after the lie had been deployed, she heard every person in this hall calculating probability and coming up short on her behalf. I don't know what she's done to herself, or what she's taken, or what performance this is. What I know is that I did not touch her, and you know me well enough to know I'm telling you the truth. Kael looked at her for a long moment. I used to think I knew you, he said. The hall was absolutely silent. He raised his voice then, not shouting. Kael Thorne never had to shout. His voice simply expanded, took up more space, filled the stone corners and high ceiling and the spaces between people's ribs. By the authority of the Alpha Throne and in protection of the Shadowfang bloodline, I am revoking the title of Luna from Elira Vale, effective immediately. Elira did not move. She heard a woman somewhere behind her say something that might have been a prayer or might have been a curse. She heard the Elder Council begin to speak among themselves in low, rapid voices. She heard Lord Fenwick exhale a breath that sounded almost like satisfaction. She did not move. You are stripped of your rank, your chambers, and your standing within this kingdom, Kael continued. His eyes never left her face, which was either the most brutal thing about it or the least cowardly, and she couldn't decide which. You will be escorted to the northern gate before sunrise. You will take nothing that bears the Shadowfang seal. You will not return. Kael, her voice was barely sound, you are making a mistake that you cannot undo. Maybe, He said it like it cost him something, like the word had weight and he was paying for it. But I will not risk my child on a maybe. It's not your child. Her voice came back louder than she intended. Look at her. Look at her clearly. Whatever she told you. Escort her out, Kyle said to the two warriors standing nearest the dais. They moved immediately. They were loyal men who had known Elira for years. She had sat at meals with their families, had negotiated safe passage for their sisters, had once convinced Kyle to spare a young warrior's life after a duel gone wrong. They moved immediately because they were pack men, and the Alpha had spoken, and no personal loyalty in a wolf kingdom survived the Alpha's direct command. Their hands landed on her arms. Elira looked at those hands, looked at the warriors' faces, both of them avoiding her eyes with the particular shame of people doing something they knew was wrong but lacked the particular grade of courage required to refuse it. Then she looked at Kyle one last time. He was watching her. He looked like he was made of stone and also like something inside him was actively tearing apart. He looked like a man who had already condemned himself and was simply waiting for the sentence to be complete. When the truth comes out, Elira said, steady as she had ever been, and it will come out, I will not be here to watch you live with it. He said nothing. She let the warriors walk her out. The hall gave way on both sides as she moved through it. Nobles and warriors and elders all stepping back, creating an aisle of clear floor between her and the door. Not out of cruelty, at least not primarily. Out of the universal human instinct to avoid physical contact with someone who is being officially destroyed, as though disgrace were something transmissible through touch. She walked the length of that hall with her spine straight and her chin level and her hands loose at her sides. She breathed, in, out, in, out. The ceremony she had spent 3 days planning burned in the torches on either side of her, and the blood wine sat untouched in its carafes on the tables she had arranged, and the flowers she had chosen were dying beautifully in the vases she had selected, and none of it had protected her. She passed the last torch. She passed through the doors. Cold air hit her face, the night air of the keep's outer corridor, and for one moment in the privacy of that passage before the guards fell in behind her, she pressed both hands against her sternum and breathed through something so large she had no word for its dimensions. It wasn't grief yet. Grief was what happened when something was over, and you had time to understand the shape of the ending. This was its precursor, that moment of pure mechanical shock when the body first registers a wound before the pain signals catch up. She had 11 years of her life inside that hall. 11 years of standing beside Cale Thorne in every crisis his kingdom had generated. She had sat up through 3 sieges watching him command. She had rewritten a trade agreement in one night because his northern allies were about to collapse over a miscommunication. She had held his hand through the death of his father, in private, in the dark, while he made sounds she had never heard him make before or since, and she had never told a living soul what that night looked like, because that was the contract of a real marriage. You held the private moments sacred even when the public ones turned to ash. She had loved him the way mountains love the cold, completely, without complaint, certain it was permanent. One of the warriors behind her cleared his throat, a reminder that sentiment didn't alter the order. Elira straightened, removed her hands from her chest, tucked them back at her sides. I need 10 minutes in my chambers, she said. Her voice was entirely even. My lady, the warrior began and then caught himself, clearly recalculating her title in real time. The Alpha said before sunrise. Then we have time. She turned and looked at him directly. He was a young man, early 20s, still carrying some softness around the jaw that would be gone in a few years. He had a wife in the Outer Pack settlement who was 7 months pregnant. Elira had sent a food parcel to their household 3 weeks ago because the winter had been hard on the settlement families, and she had noticed the young warrior getting thin. I'm not going to run. I have nowhere to go. I need 10 minutes. He nodded, miserable, and looked at the floor. She walked to her chambers alone. The rooms were warm. Someone had lit the fireplace earlier in the evening in preparation for the end of ceremony celebrations. She had requested warm fires in the royal wing for the hosting of late guests. Efficient, thoughtful, completely beside the point now. Elira stood in the center of her bedroom and catalogued. She could not take anything with the Shadowfang seal. That included her formal wear, her lunar ring, the ceremonial knives, the thick wool cloak with the silver wolf embossed on the back that she wore in winter council sessions. That included 3 shelves of administrative documents she had been working on for the spring trade negotiations, which was almost funny in a specific way that had no room for humor right now. She took her working clothes, dark leather riding pants, 2 wool undershirts, a plain coat she'd bought from a market vendor 2 years ago that bore no insignia because she'd been tired that day and hadn't wanted to represent anything. Her own boots, not the ceremonial ones, the real ones. The ones that had mud worked into the seams from the last time she'd walked the outer borders alone, because she liked to see the kingdom from ground level. A knife she'd inherited from her mother that was older than the Shadowfang alliance itself, and therefore predated any seal or claim. She stood at the fire for a moment, the warmth of it pressed against her face, which she noticed only because she was already starting to think about cold. The northern night waiting for her beyond the gate. The wilderness that stretched beyond the kingdom's borders for miles before anything resembling shelter appeared. The specific quality of the Shadowfang winter that the pack settlements were built to withstand and individual people generally weren't. She was thinking practically. She was thinking about survival, about orientation, about whether she knew enough about the northern territories to navigate without dying in the first 72 hours. She was thinking all of this instead of thinking about his face. She would save that for later, when she had the luxury of grief. She stepped away from the fire, picked up the small pack she'd assembled, and did not look back at the room she'd occupied for 11 years. The young warrior was waiting in the corridor. He couldn't meet her eyes. She didn't require him to. They walked in silence through the back passages of the keep, away from the great hall and whatever was still happening inside it, out through the servants' corridor to the northern courtyard. The moon was full above them, blood-red and enormous, hanging in the black sky like something that had witnessed a great many human disasters and had grown merely attentive about them. 2 more warriors waited at the gate. Older men, both of them. Both of them with the specific kind of rigid posture that meant they were using discipline to hold back something harder. No one spoke. The gate was opened. Elira walked through it and heard the iron bolt slide home behind her with a finality that she chose, deliberately and consciously, to hear as the sound of a chapter ending, rather than the sound of her life ending. It required effort. She applied it. Then she turned her face toward the north and began walking. The forest closed around her within minutes, the shadow of the pines swallowing the faint light from the keep behind her, until she was moving purely by moonlight and memory. The temperature dropped sharply. Her breath made white clouds in the cold air. She could feel the ground through her boots, hard frozen earth, the particular resistance of soil that hadn't thawed since autumn. She walked. She didn't cry. There would be a time for that. She acknowledged the time existed, somewhere ahead of her. But walking through a forest in the dark while crying was precisely the kind of thing that got people killed. And Elira Vale had spent 27 years in a wolf kingdom, learning above all else that the first requirement for justice was survival. She walked for 3 hours without stopping. When she finally paused, it was at the edge of a frozen creek where she needed to evaluate whether the ice would hold, and she stood there in the silence of the deep forest. No human sound, no fire sound, just wind and wood and the distant cry of something hunting in the dark, and allowed herself 30 seconds. Just 30 seconds. She stood there and breathed and felt it. The weight of what had happened. 11 years. Her name, stripped away in front of hundreds of witnesses. His face and what was on it. The hall going quiet. The doors closing, 30 seconds. Then she tested the ice, found it solid, crossed the creek, and kept walking. Back in the great hall, the ceremony had descended into controlled chaos. Healers circled Seraphine, who had been moved to the comfort of a chair near the dais and was receiving broth in careful hands. Kael sat at the high table without drinking anything, without speaking to anyone who approached him, and several people approached, staring at a fixed point on the opposite wall with the expression of a man processing something he wasn't yet sure he could process. Seraphine watched him from across the room. She kept her face arranged in careful distress, brow creased, hands still pressed to her abdomen, eyes appropriately wet when anyone looked at her directly. She had spent 6 months building toward this night. 6 months of patience so precise it had occasionally frightened even her. She had gauged Khalil's protective instincts, his specific fracture points, the exact register of accusation that would bypass his critical judgment and speak directly to the part of him that would burn the kingdom to the ground to protect what he believed was his blood. She had gauged it right. From across the room, she watched the Alpha King of Shadowfang sit in his own power with his hands folded on the table and something demolished behind his eyes. Her healer was whispering at her elbow. The one she'd been paying for 4 months, the one whose silence she owned completely. "The northern gate has been closed," he murmured, barely audible. Seraphine gave the smallest nod. "She'll survive the night," he continued. "Even in this cold, she's capable." "I know," Seraphine said softly. She didn't sound concerned. She looked across the hall at Kyle, at the damage she'd done, at the vacant chair to his left where Aluna had sat for 11 years. "It doesn't matter," she said, "what she survives." She lifted her cup of broth with her free hand and drank. Around her, the court of Shadowfang moved and grieved and gossiped and recalculated, the way courts always did when the ground shifted. Above the hall, the blood moon hung enormous and red in the sky, burning over a kingdom that had just cut out its own heart and called it justice. And somewhere in the frozen darkness beyond the northern gate, Illyra Vale walked without stopping and without looking back, moving deeper into a wilderness no one had mapped, carrying nothing except a knife, a coat, and a particular kind of fury that burns cold and burns long, and, in the right woman, in the right conditions, burns forever. 300 miles north, in a darkness so complete it felt like the edge of the world, something heard her coming. Not an animal, not a predator, something older, something that had been waiting, the way wildernesses wait, without urgency, without expectation, knowing that eventually the right kind of broken person would walk far enough into the cold to find out what they were actually made of. The Frostvale wolves called it the threshold. Every clan elder who had survived it said the same thing afterward. The threshold did not ask if you were ready. It simply showed you what you had left. The Frostvale territory had no welcome in it. That was the first thing Illyra understood about the North. Not the cold, which she had expected, and not the silence, which she had not. It was the absence of any quality that resembled invitation. The southern wolf territories, even the hostile ones, had a kind of ambient permission built into their landscape, paths worn by use, borders marked by intent, the faint echo of pack presence that told a lone wolf's instincts. Something lives here, something organized, something that has decided how this land works. The North had none of that. The North simply existed, massive and indifferent, and it would kill you the same way it preserved you, without opinion. She had been walking for 19 hours when she crossed into what the old territorial maps called the Grey Waste Buffer, a stretch of land 200 miles deep that no southern kingdom had formally claimed since the Frostvale clans were driven north 4 decades ago. The trees here were different, older, taller, the kind of trees that had grown through multiple human catastrophes and had stopped registering them. The snow between them was unbroken except for animal tracks, and twice in the last 6 hours she had felt eyes on her from somewhere in the dark that hadn't belonged to anything small. She was being watched. She had been being watched for at least 40 miles. She kept walking. Her feet had stopped hurting somewhere around hour 12. That was either adaptation or the beginning of something she didn't want to examine. She focused on her breathing, steady, measured, the kind of breath that conserved heat, and kept her eyes moving in the practiced sweep she'd developed from years of walking Shadowfang's outer borders. Near, middle, far, near, middle, far. A rhythm that kept complacency from settling in. The attack came from above, not a predator. Her instincts had already ruled that out based on the tracking pattern. Something that moved with tactical intent, using the trees not as a hunting lane, but as an observation grid. When it dropped onto the branch directly above her head and stopped there, which was itself a statement. Illyra stopped walking. She did not look up immediately. She stood, controlled her breathing, and ran the calculation she needed to run. Speed, angle, what she had on her, what she knew about Northern Wolf fighting styles from the 3 political texts she'd memorized during a particularly boring siege negotiation 3 years ago. Then she looked up. There were 4 of them in the trees. The one directly above was a young woman, early 20s, pale-skinned and dark-eyed, wearing gray wolf hide so well integrated into her gear that she had been visually part of the forest for probably the last 2 miles. She had a short blade out, tip pointing down, and she was looking at Alira with the specific expression of someone who had been given instructions but hadn't yet decided how personally to follow them. The other 3 were spread through the surrounding trees in positions that covered every exit angle. Professionals. Or something close enough to matter. "Southern wolf," the young woman said. Her accent was thick, the frost-veiled tongue that the South had been dismissing as a dialect for 40 years. "You're 200 miles past your territory markers. The markers were set by people who don't represent me anymore," Alira said. A pause. The young woman's eyes moved, not to the others, but in the brief internal way of someone recalculating. "What do you want this far north?" "Right now, fire and something to eat." Alira kept her hands visible at her sides, the knife sheathed. "After that, I want to talk to whoever's in charge of whatever this is." "Whatever this is," the young woman repeated slowly, like she was testing the phrase for disrespect and finding it somewhere just short of the line. "Perimeter patrol, I'd guess," Alira said. "Well coordinated. You've been tracking me for at least 8 hours, which means you have a relay system or very fast scouts. Either one tells me there's organization behind you. I'd like to talk to it." The silence in the trees had a different quality now. The kind of silence that is actually communication happening in a register she wasn't fully included in. The young woman dropped from the branch and landed 4 feet in front of Alira. She was shorter than expected and carried herself the way people did when they had learned early that physical size was the least reliable measure of threat. The blade was still out but angled down, no longer pointing. "You're hurt," she said, looking at Alira's right hand, which had a deep cut along the palm from where she'd grabbed a frozen branch wrong 6 hours ago and hadn't had anything to wrap it with. "It's not serious. It's infected." Alira looked at her own hand. The edges of the cut were showing the first flush of red that, in 2 days without treatment, would become a problem she couldn't walk through. She hadn't let herself register that yet because registering it hadn't been useful. "Then I'd like to talk to whoever's in charge before it gets worse," she said. The young woman studied her face for a long moment, not the hand, the face, with the thoroughness of someone reading a text they hadn't encountered before. Whatever she found there made something in her posture shift, not soften, settle. "My name is Tova," she said, and sheathed her blade. "Don't make me regret this." The Frostvile encampment was 3 miles east, built into the rock face of a ridge in a way that made it essentially invisible from the air and nearly invisible from the ground. Alira counted the structures as she walked in. Her instinct for spatial inventory was so automatic she couldn't turn it off, and revised her estimate of the clan's size upward 3 times before she stopped counting. This wasn't a small tribe sheltering from southern aggression. This was a functioning settlement, dense and deliberate, with the specific organizational logic of people who had survived hard conditions long enough to get good at it. Fires burned in stone channels carved into the rock, low and directed to minimize visible light. Children moved between structures without the scattered anxiety of a population under threat. She saw weapon stores, food stores, what looked like a dispute being settled by 3 elders near the central fire with the precise formality of a council session. People were staring at her. She was a stranger in gray leather walking through the center of a territory that had every reason to hate what she represented, and they were making no attempt to hide their assessment of her. She didn't look away from any of them. Tova brought her to a structure at the ridge's natural apex, larger than the others, built into the rock itself, firelight visible through the low doorway. At the entrance, Tova stopped. "He'll tell you to sit," she said. "Sit fast. He decides in the first 30 seconds whether someone's worth listening to. Everything after that is just him letting them finish." Alira nodded. Inside the structure, a man sat on the ground beside a stone fire channel with a stripped bone in one hand and a wet stone in the other, sharpening a blade against it with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had been doing this particular thing for decades. He was older than she'd expected, somewhere past 50, with the kind of face that wind and time had carved into something angular and impossible to read. He wore no insignia, no rank markers, nothing that declared his authority, which was precisely what authority that didn't need to prove itself looked like. He glanced up when she entered. His eyes were gray, deep-set. The the kind of eyes that had seen enough versions of the same situation that they categorized new ones within seconds. Elira sat. He looked at her for exactly the time Tova had described. Then he went back to the blade. "Southern wolf," he said, not looking up. "Exiled southern wolf," Elira said. "Who exiled you?" "My mate." He paused the whetstone for a fraction of a second. Such a small pause she almost missed it. "On what grounds?" "Fabricated ones." "They usually are," he resumed, sharpening. "What do you want from the Frost Veil?" "Nothing you don't choose to give," she said. "I'm not here to negotiate terms or trade alliances or ask for military consideration. I'm asking for enough time to heal and orient myself. After that, I'll move on if that's what you want. And if it's not what I want," Elira met his eyes, "then we'd have a more interesting conversation." The fire made small sounds between them. Somewhere outside, a child called for someone and was answered. "My name is Auric," the man said finally. "I lead the Grey Waste Frost Veil, 340 wolves, 7 subclans, all of them with good reasons to put a southern wolf in the ground before breakfast." He set the whetstone down. "You've got 1 hour. Use it to convince me that keeping you alive serves this encampment better than the alternative." "Then I'll need something to write with," Elira said, "because the Southern Kingdom's supply routes for the next trade season run through 2 passes that this encampment sits within a day's travel of. I memorized the maps, all of them. The routes, the schedules, the patrol rotations. That's what I have." She held up her infected hand. "That and a problem I need someone to look at." Auric looked at the hand, then at her face. Then he made a sound in his chest that was not a laugh but was somehow related to one. "Tova," he called. The young woman appeared in the doorway immediately. "Get Senna for her hand," Auric said. "Then bring food." He looked at Elira. "You've got more than an hour." The weeks that followed had no softness in them, and that was what made them survivable. She was given no particular status and no particular hostility. She was given work, which was the Frost Veil way of testing everything. They watched how people worked before they decided who those people were. She split wood before dawn because the encampment needed wood, and she had 2 arms and could learn the technique in under an hour. She carried water from the lower creek because the route required navigating ice, and Auric's second-in-command, a broad-shouldered woman named Roos, wanted to see how she moved on unstable ground. She sat in on 3 council sessions as an observer because she asked to, and Auric said yes with the air of someone running an experiment. She watched everything. The Frost Veil had been exiled from the Southern Territories 43 years ago, during a land consolidation that the Southern Kingdom still described in official documents as a voluntary territorial reorganization. It had not been voluntary. Entire villages had been burned and the survivors given 3 days to walk north with what they could carry. 3 days in a northern autumn, which was barely distinguished from a northern winter. The generation that remembered it was mostly gone. The generation that had grown up on the stories of it was Auric's age, and they had built every structure in this encampment on the specific architectural principles of people who expected to be attacked again and were not interested in losing twice. What she had not expected was the culture. The South thought of the Frost Veil as refugees, remnants, a diminished people holding on in the margins of a world that had discarded them. What she found was a society that had spent 4 decades developing systems the South hadn't imagined, because necessity is a more demanding architect than comfort. Their healers worked with plants the Southern medics had no names for. Their tracking methods were so sophisticated they had essentially built a communication network across 200 miles of wilderness using scouts and relay signals. Their conflict resolution process was the most efficient she had ever observed. Disputes went to a 3-elder panel, evidence was presented by both parties simultaneously, and decisions were rendered within 2 hours on the basis of testimony and logic rather than rank or wealth. She told Auric this 3 weeks in, sitting beside the central fire on an evening when the temperature had dropped far enough that breath fogged indoors. "You're surprised," he said. "I'm recalibrating," she said. "You came north expecting rubble." "I came north expecting to survive," she said honestly. "I didn't have expectations much beyond that." Auric turned a piece of wood in his hands. He did this when he was thinking, turned things, worked his hands, kept his body occupied so his mind could move freely. She'd identified the habit in the first week. "The South sent a message," he said. 3 days ago, Formal dispatch, carried by 2 warriors under diplomatic flag. Elira went very still. Shadowfang's seal, Oric continued, not looking at her. Requesting information on whether a named individual had crossed into Northern Territory, offering trade consideration in exchange for her return or her location. The fire popped between them. What did you tell them? Elira said. That we don't trade in people. He set the piece of wood down. And that their diplomat should count himself lucky we sent him home with all the same parts he arrived with. She breathed. That was your choice to make, she said carefully. Not mine. Yes. He looked at her now. So was this. You've been here 3 weeks. I've watched you work, and I've watched you think, and I've watched you sit in my council sessions and hold your mouth shut when you disagreed with something until you understood why the decision was made that way. He paused. You understood why, mostly. The Eastern supply distribution is inefficient, she said. The Eastern subclan is getting 2/3 of what the Northern subclan gets per capita, and the ratio hasn't been adjusted in 6 years, even though the Northern subclan's population has grown by 40%. I know, Oric said. Then, I needed to see if you'd say it, he said, or stay quiet to be polite. She looked at him. We have a problem in the Eastern passes, he said. His voice changed slightly. Not lower, but denser, the way voices got when they were carrying information they'd been carrying too long. Rogue hunters, not Southern Kingdom operatives, freelance. They've been running through our outer settlements for 2 months, 3 wolves dead, 11 displaced. The subclans whose territories border the passes are starting to talk about closing trade between each other as a protection measure, which would cut supply lines that the entire encampment depends on. Elira let the information settle. You want me to do something about it? I want to know if you can, he said. The Southern Luna who ran this kingdom's diplomatic and administrative operations for 11 years. I want to know what she sees when I describe this problem. She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, organizing. The subclan's closing trade is a fear response, not a strategy. It feels like protection and achieves the opposite, because isolation makes each subclan a smaller target that's easier to pick off individually than a connected network would be. The hunters know this. They're probably counting on it. She looked at the fire. I need to understand the past geography. I need to understand the inter-subclan relationships, specifically what the history is between the eastern and northern subclans, because supply disputes that have been running 6 years don't exist in a vacuum. And I need to talk to the survivors from the 3 attacks. Why the survivors? Because hunters with enough tactical sophistication to displace 11 wolves and leave 3 dead without getting caught aren't random. They have a specific operational logic. The survivors saw something that tells me what it is, even if they don't know they saw it. The fire burned between them. Tomorrow, Oric said. I'll have Tova take you to the eastern subclans. Elira nodded. One more thing, Oric said. He was looking at the fire now, not at her, with the particular sideways approach of someone raising something they weren't sure they had standing to raise. Russ tells me you cry at night sometimes, when you think the camp is quiet enough. Elira said nothing. She's not judging you, he said. Neither am I. I'm telling you because in this encampment we don't pretend things aren't happening. It's a survival rule. Pretending costs energy we can't afford. Noted, Elira said, her voice even. Whatever he took from you, Oric said, you can finish grieving it here. But I'd move fast. Winter's short up here, and we have work to do. She looked at him. At this man who had built something real in conditions designed to make building anything impossible, who led 340 wolves by the simple and extraordinary method of seeing clearly and telling the truth. I'm done grieving it, she said. She didn't know if it was true yet, but she knew that saying it out loud to someone who had no use for lies was a specific kind of commitment. Oric picked up the piece of wood again, turned it in his hands. Good, he said. The Eastern subclan meeting happened on the 4th day after the conversation with Oric. 3 days of travel through passes that Elira catalogued with exhausting thoroughness. 3 days of watching Tova move through the wilderness with the specific quality of ease that came from growing up in a place rather than learning it. 3 days of adjusting her mental map of the North from the rough sketch she'd assembled to something approaching accuracy. The subclan chief was a woman named Dara, mid-40s, solid through the shoulders, with the flat-effect patience of someone who had been asking for help for long enough that they'd mostly stopped expecting it. She met Elira and Tova at the edge of the settlement's perimeter markers, with two warriors and the kind of silence that was not hostile but was not warm either. "Oryx sent you," she said to Tova. "She asked to come," Tova said, nodding at Elira. Dara looked at Elira with the same thorough cataloging look Oryx had used. Except where Oryx's look had been assessing strategy, Dara's was assessing loyalty. The specific look of someone who had been let down by enough outside figures that the assessment of newcomers had calcified into something close to default suspicion. "Southern Wolf," Dara said. "Yes," Elira said. "You know anything about what's happening in my passes?" "Nothing yet," Elira said. "That's why I'm here." Dara studied her for another moment. Then she turned and walked into the settlement without formally inviting them, which was itself an invitation in the Frostvale way. You entered or you didn't, and the entering was its own declaration. They spent 3 hours with the survivors. 2 of the 3 had been present during the attacks. Both of them described the same operational detail without being asked to compare their accounts. The hunters had come from the north side of the eastern pass, not the south. Every southern wolf's instinct was to watch the southern approaches, the ones that connected back to the territories they'd been expelled from. The hunters knew this and were using it. Elira sat with this information and felt something sharpen behind her eyes. The particular clarity that arrived when a problem revealed its actual shape after showing you a false one. "They have someone who knows your patrol patterns," she told Dara. "This isn't random movement. They're timing entry to the passes based on when your scouts rotate. That's either a long observation period, which means they've been studying you for months, or they have a source inside the subclan's outer network." Dara's face did not change. "You're saying we have an informant?" "I'm saying the alternative is 6 months of undetected observation, which is possible but requires resources most freelance hunter groups don't have. A compromised outer network contact is more economical." The silence in the room had the quality of a stone dropping into water. "You're sure?" Dara said. "No," Elira said. "I'm offering you the most probable explanation for what your survivors described. Test it. Run a false patrol schedule through your outer network. Different information to different contacts. And see which rotation the hunters anticipate. The route they show up on tells you where the leak is." Dara looked at her for a long moment. Something in her face had shifted. Not warmth yet, but the specific quality of someone recalibrating the weight they were assigning to someone else's presence. "How do you know how to do this?" Dara said. "I spent 11 years running the administrative and intelligence operations for a kingdom that had enemies on 3 sides," Elira said. "Betrayal has recognizable patterns. Once you've seen enough of them, you stop missing them." She heard the edge in her own voice on that last sentence. Dara heard it too. Elira saw it register in the brief shift of the chief's eyes, but Dara had the grace not to pull on it. "Stay tonight," Dara said. "I want you to talk to my council." She stayed 4 nights. By the 3rd night, Dara had stopped treating her like a visitor. By the 4th night, 2 of the other Eastern subclan chiefs had arrived to sit in on the council session she ran, the one where she laid out the full operational assessment, the counter-surveillance strategy, the supply route restructuring proposal, the 3-month timeline for restoring the pass security. She ran it the same way she'd run council sessions in Shadowfang for 11 years, which was to say, with complete factual clarity and zero performance, presenting the problem and the solution in the same breath and leaving the decision where it belonged, with the people who had to live with it. When it was over, the 2 visiting chiefs talked with Dara in the low, rapid Frostvale dialect for several minutes. Elira sat quietly, not reaching for the words she could half follow. Then Dara turned back to her. "Come back to the central encampment with us," she said. "I want to tell Oryx what you did here." Elira looked at her. "You can send a message." "I want to tell him myself," Dara said, with the specific weight of someone for whom in-person declaration was not a formality, but a standard. "And I want him to hear it while you're standing next to me." The journey back to the central encampment took 2 days. They traveled in a group now. Elira, Tova, Dara, and 6 warriors from the Eastern subclan who were being transferred to the central camp for the new coordination protocol. On the 2nd night, camped at the ridgeline above the Grey Waste Valley with the encampment visible far below as a small constellation of controlled fires, Tova sat beside Elira, and looked out at the dark and said nothing for a long while. Then, "When we picked you up 3 weeks ago, you were moving like someone who'd made peace with dying." "I was moving like someone who hadn't decided yet," Alira said. "Is that different?" "Yes." She watched the fires below. "Dying is a decision. Sometimes it disguises itself as exhaustion, but it's still a decision. I hadn't made it." Tova turned her knife in her hands. Not threateningly, the same way Auric turned pieces of wood, a thinking habit. "What stopped you?" Alira thought about the frozen creek, the 30 seconds, the act of testing the ice and finding it solid. "Pride," she said, which was the most honest answer she had, and also the truest. "I wasn't going to let the last thing I did be dying in his wilderness." Tova made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "Whose wilderness is it now?" Alira looked at the valley below, at the fires that marked the edges of something she was beginning to understand as a community rather than an encampment. At the dark peaks beyond that marked the beginning of 300 miles of unclaimed territory where no southern kingdom had the reach to follow. She didn't answer immediately. Below them, one of the fires shifted, someone adding wood, the glow briefly intensifying before settling back. 340 wolves, and beyond the central camp the subclan settlements she hadn't reached yet, and beyond those the unclaimed reaches where the rogue hunters moved because they believed no organized force would follow them. They believed that because it had been true until now. Alira looked at the valley and felt the precise moment when survival stops being the goal and becomes the floor you build on. "We should sleep," she said. "Auric will want to move fast when he hears about the eastern passes." Tova nodded. She stretched out on her bedroll and was asleep within minutes with the enviable efficiency of someone whose nervous system had never learned to keep itself awake against its will. Alira stayed sitting. She looked at the fires below until they became abstract. Just light, just warmth, just the oldest signal of organized human life that existed. Then she reached into the pack beside her and drew out the knife that had belonged to her mother, older than the Shadowfang alliance, older than most of the political arrangements that had shaped the world she'd grown up in. The blade caught the moonlight. She held it for a moment, not for comfort, not for sentiment, just holding something real. Something that had weight and edge and history that had nothing to do with him. Then she put it away, lay down, and slept without dreaming for the first time in 3 weeks. In the morning, she walked into the central encampment beside Dara of the eastern subclans, and the people they passed stopped what they were doing to watch. And none of them looked at her the way the Shadowfang court had looked at her walking out through those doors. They looked at her the way people look at something they haven't seen before but already recognize. Like they'd been waiting, without knowing it, like she was exactly on time. The first snow of deep winter fell on the day Auric named her as Northern Council. He did it without ceremony, which was the most Frostvale thing about it. They were standing in the central encampment supply yard, watching the first carts from the reorganized eastern distribution route arrive, and Auric simply turned to the assembled subchiefs and said her name and her new role in the same breath he used for inventory counts. Matter of fact. Final. The way the North handled everything that mattered, by refusing to dress it up into something it didn't need to be. Alira watched the faces of the subchiefs as it landed. Dara gave one small nod that carried the weight of a prepared testimony. Roos, the broad-shouldered second-in-command who had watched Alira navigate ice on her first northern morning, crossed her arms and said nothing, which from Roos was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Two of the younger chiefs looked at each other with the private recalculation of people who had not seen this coming but were already deciding how they felt about it. The Eastern Pass hunters were gone. Not driven out, dismantled. Alira had identified the compromised outer network contact in 10 days, confirmed it in 2, and presented Dara with the evidence in the same meeting where she laid out the counter-operation. 3 weeks later, the hunter group had collapsed from the inside, their supply chain severed, their timing advantage destroyed, 2 of their scouts in Frostvale custody, and talking at length about who had hired them and why. The answer to who had hired them was the reason the subchiefs' faces looked the way they did when Auric spoke. The hunters had been financed through a shell arrangement by a minor southern trade lord with territorial ambitions in the Grey Waste buffer. Not Shadowfang, not Kyle. Something smaller and meaner. an opportunist who had looked at the Frostvale's isolation and decided that sustained harassment would fracture the subclan alliance before anyone in the South noticed or cared. He had been wrong about the fracture. He had also been wrong about the caring, because Elira had written the letter. She had done it without telling Auric first, which was the one time in 4 months she had moved ahead of him, and she had told him afterward with the same directness he had applied to her. The letter had gone south under a Frostvale diplomatic seal to 3 of the 6 neighboring kingdoms bordering the buffer, documenting the funding chain, the operation, and the identities of everyone involved. Not as a threat, as a notification, as the kind of clean factual record that turned a local harassment problem into an international liability for the man who had ordered it. The trade lord had withdrawn within a week. Auric had read the letter after the fact and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "You didn't ask me." "No," Elira said. "Why?" "Because you would have wanted to consult the sub-chiefs first, and the consultation would have taken 4 days, and in 4 days the letter's arrival window closed." She looked at him. "I'll ask first next time if you need me to." He had turned a piece of wood in his hands for a very long time. "Don't," he said finally. "Just tell me after." That had been 6 weeks ago. Now she stood in the supply yard with snow starting to fall and the title of Northern Council sitting on her like a coat that fit, which was different from any title she had worn before. The Luna title had fit too, but it had fit the way formal wear fits. Correct. Constrictive in specific places, requiring constant awareness of its presence. This fit the way her own boots fit, worn in, real. She let herself feel that for exactly as long as it took the first supply cart to finish unloading. Then she moved to help with the second. The months that followed were the hardest and most productive of her life, which was the Frostvale way of making that particular equation. Hard and productive were not opposites here. They were the same thing. She worked the supply reorganization across all 7 subclans, traveling between them on a rotation that left her sleeping in different encampments every few nights with the kind of schedule that would have destroyed most people and clarified her. She restructured the inner subclan communication relay, cutting message travel time in half by repositioning 3 scout stations. She sat in on 11 council sessions and ran 4 of them. She stopped 2 inter-subclan disputes from escalating into something that would have cost lives, not through authority, but through the particular method she had developed over 11 years in Shadowfang. The method of sitting with both sides long enough to find the practical interest underneath the expressed grievance, and building the resolution from there. She stopped crying at night after the 2nd month, not because she had finished processing what had happened to her. She had simply run out of hours in the day where there was nothing to do, and grief, she had learned, was much like an unwanted fire. It needed empty space to keep burning. She did not stop thinking about him. That was a different thing, and she had stopped pretending otherwise. She thought about him the way you thought about a structural failure you had lived through. Not with longing, mostly, but with the ongoing technical interest of a person trying to understand the exact mechanics of a collapse, so it never happened again. What she had missed, what she had accommodated that she should have questioned, the way she had loved him without ever requiring him to demonstrate that his judgment could survive the specific test of a direct challenge to something he wanted to believe. She had loved him completely, and she had not loved him clearly. And those were 2 different failures, and she owned both of them without apology and without erasure. Then the Southern Messenger arrived, and everything she had built almost came apart in a single afternoon. He came under formal diplomatic protocol, 2 Frostvale escort warriors, white-flagged, the kind of approach that required the encampment to receive him before anything else could be decided. He was not from Shadowfang. He bore the seal of the Consolidated Southern Trade Council, which Elira recognized as the political body that 3 of the 6 kingdoms she had notified about the trade lord's operation used to coordinate border policy. He was shown to the central fire and given food and drink, which the Frostvale provided to all formal diplomats regardless of what they were carrying, because hospitality was a code and codes existed precisely because they were unconditional. Elira was in the eastern supply room when Tova came to find her. She read Tova's face before Tova said a word. Not alarm, but a specific kind of tight-jawed attention that meant the situation was significant and moving fast. "Southern Council diplomat," Tova said. "He asked for you by name." "Who else is with Auric?" "Dara came in this morning. She's staying for the week. Roos and 2 of the Western sub-chiefs." "Good," Elira said, setting down the inventory she'd been working through. "Don't clear the room when I go in." She walked into the central structure with her hands loose and her face neutral, and she sat across from the diplomat at the low fire table and looked at him without speaking first, because in every negotiation she had ever run, the person who spoke first was offering something. He was in his 40s, well-fed, with the specific quality of groomed patience that men developed in long diplomatic careers, the ability to appear relaxed while doing something precise. He had northern pale skin and southern-style formal wear, which suggested he traveled this route more than occasionally. "Counselor Vale," he said. The title landed strangely. Not Luna, counselor. He had done his research. "Ambassador," she said, reading his seal classification. "What brings the Consolidated Council to the Grey Waste?" He folded his hands on the table. "3 of the 6 kingdoms you notified about the breaker operation have opened formal inquiries into Frostvale territorial sovereignty claims in the buffer." He let that sit for a moment. "It appears your letter did more than neutralize one trade lord's ambitions. It put the northern question in front of 6 governments simultaneously." Illyra said nothing. "The council would like to formalize a recognition arrangement," he continued. "Frostvale territorial sovereignty over the Grey Waste buffer in exchange for normalized trade protocols and a mutual non-aggression framework with the Southern Alliance." The fire between them burned low and steady. She knew what she was feeling, the particular voltage of a moment where something enormous was arriving, and the right response was not excitement, not caution, but the specific clarity of a person who understood that large moments required larger thinking than they appeared to. Recognition. After 43 years. The thing 3 generations of Frostvale wolves had been told, in various ways, would never happen. She did not look at Auric. She could feel him to her left, still, present, giving her nothing, and waiting. "What does the council want in exchange?" she said. The diplomat smiled with his mouth only. A stable northern border, trading partners rather than friction zones, and, he paused, the continued advisory involvement of the person who apparently convinced 3 neighboring kingdoms to take an interest in the North's well-being in the first place. There it was. She had felt it coming from the moment Tova said he'd asked for her by name. "The council wants a liaison," she said. "The council wants a northern representative with the range to operate in both environments," he said. "Someone who understands the South's administrative language and the North's territorial realities. Someone whose credibility runs in both directions." She looked at him steadily. "And if the Frostvale's interest and the council's interests diverge, that's what negotiation is for. That's not an answer." He looked at her for a moment with the recalibrating expression of someone who had prepared for several versions of this conversation and was finding the actual one running ahead of his preparation. "The council anticipates that a capable representative would navigate those divergences before they became conflicts. The council anticipates that I would protect their interests first," she said flatly, "because I have a Southern background, and they assume that background is a loyalty rather than a history." She tilted her head slightly. "It's not." The silence had weight. "I represent the Frostvale," she said. "If the council wants a liaison, they are hiring an advocate for the North, not a Southern proxy embedded in a Northern court. If that's a problem, this conversation is short." The diplomat looked at her for a long time. Then he unfolded his hands and picked up his cup of broth and drank from it, and when he set it down, his posture had shifted. Something releasing, something that might have been the particular relief of a professional who had been authorized to find a genuine counterpart and had finally found one. "That," he said, "is exactly what 3 of the 6 kingdoms are counting on." The negotiation ran for 4 days. She ran it with Auric at her left and Dara at her right, using Auric as the final authority on territorial specifics and Dara as the voice of the subclan collective, positioning herself as the operational translator between the council's procedural language and the Frostvale's territorial reality. She had done this kind of work in Shadowfang for years, but had always done it on someone else's behalf. Running it on behalf of the Frostvale felt different in every cell of her body, a kind of alignment between what she was doing and who she was doing it for that she had not experienced before, and found briefly overwhelming in a way she absorbed quickly, quietly, and mentioned to no one. The recognition framework was initialed on the 4th evening. Not signed, the formal signing required a full council assembly that would take weeks to arrange, but initialed, which in diplomatic practice meant the substantive agreement was done and the formal signing was a ceremony. After the diplomat left with his escort, Oryx sat in the central structure for a long time without moving. 43 years, he finally said. Alira nodded. He turned a piece of wood in his hands. Then he set it down and looked at her directly, which was unusual enough that she read it as significant. You could have framed that as your achievement. It's not my achievement. You wrote the letter. I wrote the letter because I had information and a skill set that happened to be useful at the right moment, she said. The Frostvale built 340 wolves' worth of legitimate governance in 43 years of conditions that would have dismantled most kingdoms. That's what made the letter credible. I just held the pen. Oryx studied her face. You believe that? Yes. Most people in your position wouldn't. She thought about that, about the specific gravitational pull of credit, how power accumulated around it, how it distorted people, how she had watched it distort the Shadowfang court for 11 years, how easy it would have been, right now, to let this moment mean something about her rather than about the people it actually belonged to. Most people in my position weren't exiled into a wilderness and given a second education by people who had already learned everything the hard way, she said. I had good teachers. Oryx made the sound that was related to a laugh. He picked up the piece of wood again. Then Tova came through the door at a speed that was not running but was not walking, and every temperature in the room dropped. There's a problem, Tova said. She had ridden from the Western Pass in 6 hours, which was 3 hours faster than the route should have taken, which meant she had pushed her horse past safe speed and known it, and done it anyway. Her face was controlled, but her eyes had the specific quality of someone who had been holding something compressed for 6 hours and was about to release it. Sit down, Oryx said. I'd rather stand. She looked at Alira. The Southern Dispatch that came last month, the one asking for information on you, that Oryx turned away. Alira kept her face neutral. Yes. It wasn't the only one. Tova's jaw tightened. There were 2 others sent to the northern subclans directly, not routed through the central camp, bypassing Oryx's authority entirely. The fire made small sounds. Which subclans? Oryx said quietly. Hartvik's group in the Western Pass and the Coldwater subclan along the northern ridge. Tova's eyes didn't leave Alira's face. They didn't respond to the dispatches, but someone in Hartvik's outer network passed information back, movement records, supply route details, the new relay station positions. The thing that moved through Alira then was not panic. It was something colder and more clarifying, basot. The recognition she had felt once before, standing in the Shadowfang Hall listening to Seraphine speak, of understanding exactly what was happening before the consequences had finished arriving. How long, she said. The timing on the information transfer lines up with the last 6 weeks, Tova said. Which means the recognition negotiation, Alira said. Tova nodded. Someone in the south got word of the council's approach, Alira said, working it out as she spoke, watching it build. They knew the council was coming to formalize recognition. They needed information to disrupt the negotiation before it completed. Current positions, supply vulnerabilities, anything that could be packaged as leverage or used to demonstrate that the Frostvale was too unstable for formal recognition. She stopped, looked at the fire. Or used to bring a southern force through the northern passes before the ink on the framework agreement dried, she said quietly. The silence had a different quality now. The quality of a space where everyone present had just understood the same thing at the same moment. Oryx's voice was very flat. Who sent the dispatches? Tova set a sealed message cylinder on the table. The seal was broken. Tova had opened it in transit, which she would not have done unless she was certain of what she was bringing. The routing cipher on the original dispatch traces back through 3 trade intermediaries. She paused. The final origin point is a Shadowfang administrative seal. The room went absolutely still. Alira looked at the cylinder on the table. Cale Thorne had been trying to find her for 6 months. She had known this, at some level, the way you knew things that you had filed away in the part of your mind designated for information that was true, but not currently actionable. He had sent a formal dispatch to Oryx's camp in the early weeks. She had assumed that was the full extent of it, a procedural attempt, easily refused, finished. She had been wrong. The dispatches to the subclans were not a procedural attempt. They were a systematic strategy, going around Oryx's authority to find a softer access point, gathering intelligence on her location and the encampment structure, building the kind of operational picture that had a specific use. She thought about what she had told Dara about the hunters. They have someone who knows your patrol patterns. The same thing had been done to her. How bad is it? She said to Tova. The relay station positions are compromised. Tova's voice was steady through visible effort. If someone wanted to move a significant force through the Western Pass in the next 2 weeks before winter closes the route, they would know exactly where our scouts aren't. Oryx stood. He did it slowly, the way he did everything, but there was something different in his body now. The compressed energy of a man who had spent 43 years protecting 340 wolves from the south by staying 2 steps ahead of it, and who had just learned that those 2 steps had been measured and accounted for. He looked at Alira. She met his eyes and did not look away from what she saw there. Not accusation, not yet, but the genuine question of a man who had extended trust in a specific and deliberate direction and was now running the calculation on what that trust had cost. I didn't know, she said. I know you didn't, he said. He said it immediately, which was more than she had expected and more than she deserved the luxury of. That doesn't change what it means. No, she said, it doesn't. She looked at the cylinder on the table, at the broken Shadowfang seal. At 11 years of her life compressed into a wax stamp that had just reached 300 miles north to threaten the only thing she had built since losing everything. The anger arrived then. Not the hot kind. She had moved past the hot kind months ago in the frozen wilderness, burned it clean. This was the cold kind, the functional kind. The kind that didn't want to scream, it wanted to work. Tell me the exact window on the Western Pass before winter closes it, she said to Tova. 14 days, maybe 16 if the weather holds. And the force size that the compromised intelligence could support. Tova looked at Oryx. He nodded. Comfortably. 80 wolves. Pushing it up to 120. Alira stood. She walked to the wall map that Oryx kept pinned to the stone, the detailed territorial chart she had spent months helping to update with new scout data. She looked at the Western Pass, at the relay station positions marked in charcoal, at the gap that compromised intelligence would create. She saw it. The entry point, the approach angle, the settlement that sat in the path of the most direct route through. The Coldwater subclan. 47 wolves, children. The same northern settlement that had received a direct Shadowfang dispatch and passed information back without understanding what it would be used for. She turned around. Oryx was watching her. Dara had come to stand beside him. Tova stood near the door. All of them watching her with the same question in their faces. Not accusation, but the raw and genuine inquiry of people who had trusted her, who had built something with her, who were now standing on the edge of understanding that trust had opened a door and waiting to see whether she was going to walk through it with them or walk through a different one entirely. This was the moment. She understood it with complete precision. Not a moment for strategy, not yet. A moment for something more fundamental. The decision about who she was going to be and the specific conditions that made the question worth asking. She had been a Luna who loved her king completely and never required him to prove he deserved it. That woman was gone. Move the Coldwater subclan to the central camp, she said. All of them. Tonight if possible, before dawn, if not. Don't tell them the full situation. Tell them it's a winter consolidation protocol. Tell Hartvik's outer network the same thing. She looked at Tova. I need the names of every contact in the outer network that the compromised intelligence touched. You're going to close the information leak, Tova said. I'm going to do more than that. Alira looked at Oryx. I need to send a message south. Not diplomatic protocol. Personal seal, private courier, direct channel. She held his eyes. I need to tell someone exactly what is coming through that pass and exactly what will happen to it when it arrives. Oryx looked at her for a long moment that contained every question about who she was and who she served. Write it, he said. I'll read it before it goes. She nodded. She turned back to the map and began working, and in the particular way that the body sometimes did during moments that changed the shape of a life. She felt perfectly clear. Not calm, not easy, but clear the way only impossible choices made you clear, stripped of every comfortable middle ground, standing at the exact center of who she had been and who she was going to become. Behind her, the fire burned low. Outside, the first serious snow of deep winter was starting to fall in earnest, filling the gray waste passes, covering tracks, closing the world down to what it actually was. The North, where the only things that survived were the things that learned over and over and over, that there was no version of safety that didn't require you to become equal to the danger that was coming. She picked up the pen. She started to write. And somewhere in the language she used, precise, cold, stripped of everything except the truth of what was moving and where, was the last remnant of the woman who had once believed that loving someone completely was the same as being safe with them. It wasn't. It never had been. And the queen she was becoming had no use for the confusion. The letter took her 4 hours to write. Not because she lacked words, she had never lacked words, but because every version she produced in the first 3 hours was either too much or too little. Too much, and it read as the wounded communication of a woman who had not finished processing what happened to her. Too little, and it failed its operational purpose, which was the only purpose that mattered right now. She wrote it 7 times. The 8th version was correct. She knew it the way she knew when supply calculations were right, not by feeling, by the absence of anything wrong. It was 43 words. It contained no personal address, no accusation, no reference to the blood moon night or the frozen walk or any of the 11 years that preceded them. It contained the past coordinates, the 14-day window, the compromised relay positions, and one sentence at the end that was not tactical but was necessary. The sentence read, "Whatever you believe I did or didn't do, these are your people moving through that pass, and when they don't come home, that will be on both of us." She handed it to Auric. He read it standing, which was how he read everything that required a decision. When he finished, he looked at her with the specific expression she had learned to read as the Frostvale version of respect. Not warm, not demonstrative, but genuine in the way that only things stripped of performance were genuine. "The courier goes at dawn," he said. "The Coldwater move starts in 2 hours." She nodded and went to help pack. The Coldwater subclan arrived at the central encampment in 3 staggered groups over a day and a half, guided in through paths that the compromised outer network didn't know existed. Routes Tova had mapped personally 2 months ago during the Eastern Pass work, unmarked on any chart that had moved through official channels. 47 wolves, including 11 children and 4 elders who moved slowly and asked few questions, which was itself a kind of dignity that Alira observed and did not forget. She worked through the night of the first arrival and the full day following, coordinating shelter expansion, adjusting food distribution for the population increase, running a quiet reassessment of every outer network contact that had been within range of the compromised dispatches. She did this with the flat, sustained focus of someone who had learned in the wilderness that exhaustion was a condition to be managed rather than resolved, and who had since refined that lesson into something approaching art. On the 3rd night, Tova found her in the supply structure at 2 hours past midnight and simply sat beside her and said nothing for a long while. "You're not sleeping," Tova said. "I'll sleep when the window closes." "That's 14 days from now." 11, actually. The weather's shifting." Tova looked at her profile. "You're scared." Elira kept her eyes on the inventory in front of her. "Yes. Of the force coming through the pass. Of what I'll do if it gets through," Elira said quietly. "The pass I can plan for. What comes after. What I'd have to become to protect this encampment from the consequences. That's the part I'm scared of." She turned a page. "I know what I'm capable of when something I've built is in danger. I didn't used to know. I know now." Tova was quiet for a moment. "Is that a bad thing?" "No," Elira said. "That's what makes it frightening." She went back to the inventory and Tova stayed beside her until she fell asleep sitting up against the supply wall, which Elira allowed because sending her away would have required more energy than she had available, and because the company was, in the specific privacy of 2 in the morning, something she needed and would not have asked for. On the 9th day, the scouts reported movement in the Western Pass. Not a full force. A preliminary survey group of 8 wolves moving in the pattern she had predicted, following the route the compromised relay positions had made available. Auric received the report at the central fire with Alira and Roos and 2 Western subclan chiefs standing around him, and he looked at the scout position markers on the map for exactly the time it took to confirm what they all already knew. "They're moving on schedule," Roos said. "They're moving on the intelligence they received," Alira said, which means they don't know we moved Coldwater. They don't know the relay stations are repositioned. They think they're walking into a corridor with a blind spot. She looked at the map. They're not. The main force, Oryx said. 2 days behind the survey group, standard Southern Advanced Protocol. She touched the map at the pass's narrowest point. This is where you want to be when they commit. How many? Your best read? 90 to 100. Kyle doesn't run light operations, but he won't push more than that through a mountain pass in early winter without full supply infrastructure. And full supply infrastructure takes longer than the window allows. She paused. He came fast, which means he came with what he had, not what he would have wanted. Oryx looked at her. You know how he thinks. I know how he thinks when he's operating from guilt rather than strategy, she said. He came because he believes he's correcting a wrong. People correcting wrongs make different mistakes than people pursuing objectives. They move faster than they should. They accept risk they would normally refuse. They convince themselves that urgency is a substitute for preparation. She looked at the map. That's his vulnerability. The silence held for a moment. And if he's not coming to correct a wrong, Roos said, if he's coming to retrieve an asset. Elira felt the word hit somewhere specific in her chest. Asset. The precise clinical reduction of 11 years to its political remainder. She absorbed it without expression. Then he makes the same mistakes for different reasons, she said, and the vulnerability holds. Oryx studied the map for a long time. What do you need? 30 scouts, experienced in the western terrain, the new relay positions fully operational, and I need Dara's eastern warriors. They've worked with me. They know my movement language. I can't coordinate with strangers in tight conditions. Dara's here until end of week. I know. He looked at her. You're going out there yourself. Yes. I need a better reason than yes. She met his eyes directly. Because the person who understands this force's operational logic is the person who spent 11 years building it. Because if there's a way to stop 90 wolves without killing any of them, I'll find it in the field before a commander who doesn't know them will find it from this encampment. And because, she paused, if Kyle is leading personally, what happens in that pass is going to require someone who can speak to him in a language that doesn't start a war we can't finish. Oryx turned wood in his hands. The fire burned between them. Don't get killed, he said. It was the most he ever gave anyone, and she knew it, and she took it exactly as the weight it was. She moved out with 32 wolves at first light the following morning. The Western Pass in late autumn had a specific quality that she had not experienced from the inside before. The cold was the dry, airless kind that lived above elevation, not the wet, penetrating cold of the gray waste flatlands. And it moved through clothing differently, found different seams, required constant small adjustments rather than one good preparation. She moved with her pack high and her breathing controlled, following Tova at point and reading the terrain the way she now read everything, for what it was telling her, not for what she expected it to say. They reached the first relay station repositioning at midday. The station was a small rock shelf arrangement that had been reconstructed 40 meters northeast of its original position, close enough to the old location that anyone moving on original intelligence would pass it without registering the change, far enough that its coverage angle had completely rotated. The scouts stationed there gave a signal as they approached. Clean. No contact yet from the survey group. They moved to the second station, then the third, each one confirmed, each one exactly where she had placed it on the redesigned map. On the afternoon of the second day in the pass, Tova raised a fist from point position, and every wolf in the line went still. Elira moved forward through the column to Tova's position. Tova was reading the ground, boot marks in the thin snow, specific spacing and depth, with the concentrated physicality of someone doing something her body knew better than her mind did. Survey group came through here, Tova said quietly. Maybe 18 hours ago. Heading northeast, toward the old Coldwater settlement position. So they had done what she expected. The survey group had gone ahead to confirm what the intelligence described. An accessible settlement, predictable patrol patterns, a viable entry point for the main force. What they had found was an empty settlement and the wrong silence. The silence of a place that had been cleared rather than a place that was asleep. They'll report back, Elira said. When the main force hears the settlement is empty, one of two things happens. They abort the pass and pull back before winter closes it, or whoever is leading decides the cleared settlement is confirmation that the intelligence was good, and they moved the target rather than lost it. Tova looked at her. Which one? Alira thought about Kael, about the specific quality of his operational stubbornness, the trait that had held a siege for 9 months, the trait that had won 3 border conflicts that the tactical assessment said were unwinnable, the trait she had loved because it was real and hated because it did not know when to stop. Neither, she said. He'll split the difference, pull the survey group back, advance the main force to the pass entrance, and make the final decision from there. He won't commit blind, but he won't retreat without standing at the edge himself. Tova absorbed this. So he comes to the pass entrance? Yes. And we're positioned at the pass entrance? Yes. That's a conversation, not a battle. That's the idea, Elira said. Tell Dara's warriors to hold position at the eastern ridge. Nobody moves unless I signal. She positioned herself at the natural rock shelf that formed the pass entrance's widest point, a shelf that gave her elevated sight lines in 3 directions while being visible from the western approach. She sent 10 scouts to the ridgeline above, 10 to the eastern flanking position, and kept 12 with her on the shelf. She set no ambush formation, built no trap. She stood at the edge of the shelf in plain sight and waited. The main force arrived at the pass entrance on the morning of the 3rd day. She heard them before she saw them. The particular acoustic quality of a coordinated group moving through mountain terrain, boot rhythm, and equipment sound, the kind of noise that an organized force made when it was not trying to hide because it did not believe anyone was ahead of it. Then the lead wolves appeared at the pass mouth, and then more behind them, and then she was doing the count she had trained herself to do automatically, 78, 82, 89, and they were exactly what she had predicted, and that fact gave her no comfort at all. The force stopped when they saw her, not because she was frightening. One woman standing on a rock shelf with 12 wolves visible around her was not by volume a threat to 90. They stopped because of what it meant, because it answered the question the empty settlement had raised, because the person standing on that shelf in northern gray leather, with her hands loose at her sides and her face entirely clear, was not supposed to be there, and her being there meant someone had known they were coming. The force leader raised a fist and the column halted. Then a single figure moved through the stopped column toward the front, and Alira felt the particular quality of recognition that lived below thought. In the chest, in the hands, in the specific rhythm of breathing that shifted without permission. Cale Thorne walked to the front of his column and looked up at her. He had aged. 7 months, and he had aged in the specific way that the aftermath of a catastrophic mistake aged people. Not uniformly, but in lines of tension across the jaw and forehead, in the particular flatness of eyes that had been replaying something they couldn't stop. He was still built the same, still moved with the same contained physical authority she had watched move through 1,000 rooms. He was wearing campaign gear rather than formal wear, which meant he had come out here himself, leading rather than directing, which was either nobility or an inability to delegate the consequences of what he had done. She had stopped asking which one it was. The answer didn't change anything. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. The pass was very quiet. Wind moved through it at low pressure, making the kind of sound that fills silence without breaking it. Elira, he said. Just her name. Nothing before it and nothing after it, and everything in the world compacted into 2 syllables by the specific gravity of a man who had been rehearsing this moment for 7 months and found, on arrival, that every version he had prepared was wrong. She looked down at him from the shelf. You have 78 hours before this pass closes, she said. Use them to go home. Something moved across his face. I'm not here to fight. You brought 90 wolves into Frostfield territory with Northern Settlement intelligence in your operational brief, she said. What you're here to do is a conversation for a different day. Right now I'm telling you the practical reality. She held his gaze. The pass closes in 78 hours. If your force is still in it when it closes, they winter here. You have supply for 8 days maximum at March rations, which means attrition starts on day 9. She watched him process this. The specific look of a tactician recalculating, running numbers against terrain and weather, arriving at the same conclusion she had. You moved the Coldwater settlement, he said. I moved 47 people out of the path of 90 wolves, she said. Yes. The silence between them was very full. Come home, he said. His voice had changed. The tactical flatness had dropped out of it, leaving something rawer and worse. That's all I'm asking. Come home, and I will spend however long it takes making this right. The court knows what Seraphine did. The court knows what I did. You can come back as Luna with full restoration. Stop. Her voice was not loud, but it was absolute. Stop there. He stopped. Behind him, his force was utterly still. 90 wolves watching a conversation they didn't have context for but could feel the weight of, the way animals felt pressure changes before weather arrived. You came 300 miles to offer me a title, she said. I came 300 miles because I was wrong. The words came out with the specific rawness of something that had been compressed for a very long time. Because I stood in that hall and chose to believe a lie over the truth I knew in my own bones. And I sent you into a wilderness in winter with nothing, and I have been living inside that decision every day since. His jaw was working. I'm asking you to come home. She looked at him from the shelf. She looked at him and she ran the honest accounting the way she ran every calculation now, without comfort, without wish fulfillment, without the particular editorial distortion of strong feeling. She looked at him, and she knew without any ambiguity that what she saw was real. The guilt was real. The pain was real. The 7 months of living inside a mistake that had no clean edge were written across every line of his face with the legibility of something that couldn't be performed. She also knew, and this was the part that had clarified over 7 months in the north, over wood splitting and water carrying and treaty negotiations in a frozen creek in the dark, she also knew with complete and unsentimentable precision that what she felt for him was no longer the thing that had governed her choices. She had loved him the way you loved the first solid ground you ever stood on, completely, without question, because the alternative was not standing anywhere. She had since found other ground. I'm not coming home, she said. The words landed in the past with the finality of a stone coming to rest. No echo, just landing. His face did something complicated that she watched without looking away from, because she owed him that much. To witness it, to not turn from the cost of what she was saying, to understand that her clarity came at a real price, that a real person was paying in front of her. Elira, I want you to listen to me, she said, not because I owe you anything, because what I'm about to say is the last time I'm going to say it, and after this I'm going to need you to make a decision. She looked down at him from the shelf, and her voice was steady with the specific steadiness of someone who had done the work of arriving at a true thing and was now simply reporting it. Shadowfang is your kingdom, and you are its king, and I believe, genuinely believe, that you have the capacity to be a better one than the man who stood in that hall 7 months ago. I hope you are. The people who live there deserve it. She paused. But I am not yours to reclaim, she said. I am not a Luna waiting for a title restoration. I am Northern Counsel to the Frostveil, and I am standing in a pass that leads to my people. And if your force does not turn around in the next 10 minutes, the conversation we're having right now is going to become a very different kind of conversation. His eyes had changed. She saw it happen. The shift from grief to the thing beneath grief. The anger that grief was sitting on top of. The anger of a man who had traveled 300 miles and prepared the right words and was being told the words were the wrong currency entirely. Your people, he said. Yes. These aren't your people. You've been here 7 months. These are the people who did not strip me of my name in front of hundreds of witnesses, she said quietly. These are the people who looked at what I had left after you finished with it and said it was enough. Her voice stayed level. 7 months is longer than a lifetime sometimes. It depends on what happens inside it. He stood at the base of the shelf, and she stood at the top of it, and the distance between them was not physical. The wind moved through the pass. He looked at her for a long time with everything that was left of what they had been to each other present and visible on his face, and she held his gaze because the woman she had become did not look away from hard things, and this was the hardest thing she had done since the frozen creek. Then something happened. At the eastern ridgeline, a sound, sharp, abrupt, the sound of movement that was not planned. Elira's eyes moved there instantly, read the shape of it, and felt her entire body go cold with understanding before the words arrived. Tova's voice, from somewhere below the ridge. Contact, eastern flank. 8 wolves, unknown pack markers. They came up from the southern split in the pass. They've been behind your main column the whole... The sound of the fight starting cut her off. Not a skirmish. A coordinated assault from wolves who had used Kael's column as cover to advance on the ridge position, who had moved in the acoustic shadow of 90 other bodies and reached the flanking scouts before the flanking scouts had reason to look behind them. Not Kael's wolves. The pack markers were wrong, Tova had said. Unknown. Alira's mind ran the calculation in under a second. The survey group. The 8 wolves that had gone ahead to Coldwater found it empty and reported back. They had not all reported back. 2 or 3 had stayed in the pass, not under Kyle's orders, under someone else's. Someone who had wanted to know exactly where Alira would position herself if a southern force came through the pass. Someone who had used both sides of the intelligence operation to triangulate her. Not Kyle. Someone using Kale. The same operational logic as the Coldwater hunters. Financed, directed, precise. She was already moving off the shelf, already signaling the 12 wolves around her with the rapid hand language she had spent 7 months drilling until it was faster than speech. "Hold your column," she said to Kyle as she passed him, her voice stripped to pure information. "Do not move. Do not engage. Stay exactly where you are and keep your wolves still." "Elira, I don't have time," she said, and she was already running toward the sound of the fight on the eastern ridge, her knife out, her boots finding purchase on the frozen rock with the automatic competence of someone who had been learning this terrain for months, her mind sorting targets and angles and the specific chaotic geometry of a close engagement in tight mountain conditions. Behind her she heard Kael's voice, not calling her name, the command voice, sharp and carrying, cutting across his column. "Nobody moves. Hold." She didn't look back. Above her on the eastern ridge, the fight was still happening, which meant Tova's wolves were still alive, which was the only piece of current information that mattered. She hit the base of the ridge path at full speed and went up it the way she had gone up a dozen ridge paths in the past 7 months. Weight forward, hands ready, breathing through the burn in her lungs with the cold air that tasted like iron at this altitude. She came over the ridge crest and saw it. 6 wolves engaged with Tova's position. 2 more moving around the north side in a flanking arc. Tova herself was down on one knee, not incapacitated. She was moving, she was working, but there was blood on the left side of her face from something that had connected. Alira moved without planning. Planning was for before. This was the territory of the body. She took the flanking arc first because the 2 wolves moving north were about to close a pincer that would end the engagement in the wrong direction. She came in at speed, and her knife found the leading wolf's weapon arm with the mechanical precision of someone who had been taught that the goal of a knife in a close fight was not to kill, but to remove capacity. And he went down clutching his forearm with the genuine involuntary focus of a person who could no longer multitask. The second flanking wolf turned to engage her. He was bigger, faster, and had the specific quality of stillness right before movement that marked someone who had done this before and was not rattled. Alira felt the calculation in her chest rather than her mind. Not afraid, but deeply honest about the accounting. He outweighed her by 70 pounds of muscle, and he had a longer reach, and he was not compromised. She let him commit first. It was the only move available to her, and she had learned it not from training, but from 7 months of being the smaller entity in every physical interaction in a territory that rewarded adaptation over stubbornness. She let him commit, moved into the angle his commitment created, and used the weight differential as the conversion mechanism it was. He hit the ridge rock instead of her. She was already past him and moving toward Tova's position. What happened in the next 4 minutes she would not be able to fully reconstruct afterward. This was the consistent experience of close quarters engagement that every warrior she had ever spoken to described. The way time became granular and the sequence became fragmentary, and what you remembered were specific images rather than a continuous film. She remembered Dara's eastern warriors coming over the South Ridge crest at a run, having broken from their hold position at the sound of the assault. She remembered the engagement collapsing. Not a victory, a collapse. The sudden loss of operational coherence in the attacking force when the numbers shifted and they understood they were no longer doing what they had planned to do. She remembered one of the attacking wolves, restrained on the ground by 2 of Dara's warriors, looking up at her with an expression she had seen once before, in a Shadowfang prison cell, on the face of a man who knew he had been caught and was calculating how much his silence was worth versus how much talking might buy him. She crouched in front of him on the frozen ridge rock, breathing hard, blood from a cut on her forearm she hadn't felt happen staining her sleeve. "Who sent you?" she said. He looked at her, calculating. "The pass closes in 74 hours, she said. "You have two options. You talk to me now, here, where I can do something with what you tell me. Or you talk to Auric in the central encampment in 3 days, where the only thing your information will be worth is proof that something bigger than a hiring arrangement is operating in these passes." She looked at him steadily. "The first option has better outcomes for you." He held for 8 more seconds. She watched him hold. Then he spoke a name. She absorbed it. Absorbed it the way she absorbed all large things now, without visible reaction, with the internal stillness of someone who had been trained by hard experience that the moment of information arrival was not the moment for response. The moment for response was after. She stood. The name he had spoken was not a trade lord's name. It was not a minor political operative. It was the name of someone who sat in a council chamber 400 miles south, who had attended the blood moon ceremony, who had been in that hall 7 months ago when Seraphine collapsed on the floor. Someone who had been managing this from the beginning. Someone who had not been finished when the blood moon night ended. She turned and looked down from the ridge at the pass entrance below, where Kyle force stood exactly where she had told them to stand. 90 wolves in formation and their king at the front of them, his face turned up toward the ridge, with the expression of a man who had just watched something happen that he didn't have context for and was standing very still inside the not knowing. The wind moved through the pass. Elira stood on the ridge above the man who had exiled her, holding the name of the person who had orchestrated everything that followed, watching the pass entrance with the particular quality of clarity that arrived at the intersection of everything. The last 7 months, and the 11 years before them, and the 47 Coldwater wolves safe in the central encampment, and the recognition framework with the council's seal still drying on the initialed copy, all of it converging into a single present moment that required the next decision. She had the name. She had the force below her, and the wounded on the ridge, and the pass closing in 74 hours. She had everything she needed and no time to decide which thing to do with it first. Her eyes found Kyle's from the ridge. He was still looking up at her, still waiting, still... And this was the thing she had not expected, the thing that complicated the arithmetic. Still, visibly and completely, on her side of whatever was about to happen. Not because she had asked him to be. Because he had held his column on her word, in the middle of an engagement he didn't understand, against every instinct a military leader had in him. Because when she had said, "Hold," he had held. The wind cut through the pass with the sharp edge of weather that was changing and not changing in the direction she needed. 74 hours. The name in her chest like a coal. And the man below her, waiting. Would have made at any point in the last 7 months if the same information had arrived in a different order. She walked directly to Kyle. Not because she had forgiven him. Not because the 74-hour window had made her generous or the blood on her sleeve had made her sentimental. She walked to him because the name the captured wolf had spoken connected two things that had seemed separate, the Blood Moon Night and the Western Pass assault. And connecting them meant the threat was larger than one pass, larger than one season, larger than anything she could address alone with 32 wolves and the Frostvale's current reach. She walked to him and she looked at him and she said the name. She watched it land on his face. She had expected recognition. She had not expected the specific quality of recognition she saw. Not surprise, but the dawning, sickened look of a man who had suspected something for months and had been refusing the conclusion because the conclusion was unbearable. His jaw set. His eyes went flat. He looked the way men looked when the architecture of a betrayal they had been living inside finally revealed its full dimensions. "Say it again," he said. She said it again. He turned away from her, not fleeing, processing. He stood with his back to her and his hands at his sides, and she watched his shoulders do the specific controlled movement of someone managing a physiological response that they will not allow to become visible behavior. 8 seconds, 9. Then he turned back. "How long?" he said. "I don't know the beginning," she said. "Long enough to build the Coldwater Hunter operation. Long enough to establish a separate intelligence channel to the Western Pass subclans. Long enough to use your search for me as cover for their own operation." She held his gaze. long enough that they were in position before Seraphine ever walked into the Blood Moon Hall. The silence between them had a different quality now than any silence they had shared before. Not the silence of two people who had run out of things to say to each other. The silence of two people standing on the same side of a problem for the first time in 7 months, feeling how strange the ground felt beneath their feet from that position. "They used me," he said. "Yes." "From the beginning." "From before the beginning," she said. Seraphine was the mechanism. The person whose name you just heard was the architecture. He looked at her with something raw and wrecked moving behind his eyes. She had seen this look once before, in the private dark, years ago, the night his father died. She had held his hand through it then. She did not hold his hand now. She stood still and witnessed it, because some things you owed the person they were happening to, and the specific debt of witnessing was one of the ones she still carried. "What do you need?" he said. "Not what do you want. Not what do you think I should do. What do you need?" The command mind kicking in, which was the best of him, the thing she had genuinely loved, the ability to set aside his own devastation when something required action and move toward the action without hesitation. "Your force turns around and goes home," she said. "Not because I'm sending you away. Because what you need to do is waiting for you in Shadowfang, and I can't come with you to do it. That means you need to go do it yourself." She paused. "Your command structure has been compromised for at least a year, probably longer. Every decision you made in that time has been operating on information that someone was managing. When you get home, you start from the assumption that everything you believed was filtered." She met his eyes. Everything. He heard the double weight of that word. She saw him hear it. His jaw tightened once and released. "The court, the council, the advisors," he said. "All of it," she said. "Audit everything. Trust no one you haven't personally tested. And when you find the evidence, and you will find it, it'll be there. People who operate this way always leave evidence because they're confident they'll never need to account for it. Don't hold a ceremony. Don't make it a spectacle. Just remove it cleanly and rebuild from what's left." She paused. "That's my professional advice." "As Northern Council," he said, "as someone who spent 11 years running your kingdom's administrative operations and knows exactly where the load-bearing walls are." He was quiet for a moment. "You could come back," he said, and it was different from the previous time he had said it. The previous time had been grief-talking. This was something more difficult. The genuine, practical acknowledgement of someone who understood both the offer and the likelihood of its refusal. "Not as Luna, not as anything I need you to be, as yourself. With whatever title means something to you." She looked at him for a long time. The pass around them was quiet. His force held formation. Her wolves held the ridge. The wind moved through the rock faces with the indifference of terrain that had been here longer than any of the human drama playing out within it, and would be here long after. "The Frostveil recognition framework initialed with the Consolidated Council 3 weeks ago," she said. "When it formalizes, it establishes the first official Northern sovereignty in 43 years. I am Northern Council to Oryx Encampment, and I am the designated liaison for the recognition negotiations." She kept her voice even. "That's not a role I can perform from Shadowfang, and it's not a role I would give up." He absorbed this. She watched him do the arithmetic that she had already done. The political arithmetic, the geographic arithmetic, the arithmetic of what she was and where she was and who she had chosen to be accountable to. "No," he said quietly. "Not to her, to himself, to the conclusion." "No," she agreed. Another silence. Then, with the particular directness of a man who had decided that everything else had been said and what remained required precision. "Are you well?" The question was so simple after everything that it almost broke through something she was not prepared to have broken through. She steadied herself in a way she hoped was not visible. "I am very well," she said. And it was true. Entirely, uncomplicatedly true, in a way that she had not expected to be able to say to him and still feel clean saying it. "I am better than I have been." He looked at her with something in his face that she recognized as the most honest emotion she had ever seen there. Not love, or what had called itself love, but something older and less comfortable. Respect. The genuine kind. The kind that arrived after all the easier feelings had burned off and left only the clear-eyed recognition of what someone was. "I know," he said. He said it like it cost him something, and she believed that it did, and she honored the cost without offering anything in exchange, because there was nothing to offer. She had not caused the cost. She had simply become the person whose existence generated it. "Go home, KL," she said. Not unkindly. With the full weight of everything she had ever felt for him and everything she had learned since, compressed into 4 words that were as honest as anything she had ever said. "Go fix what's left. There's enough left. There always was." He stood there for one more moment. Then he turned and walked back to his column, and she heard his voice carry the command to turn and move, clean and final. And the force began to move back through the pass entrance the way professional soldiers moved, without discussion, without visible emotion, because the Alpha had spoken. She stood at the pass entrance and watched them go until the last wolf was out of sight. Then she sat down on the frozen ground, right there, and put her face in her hands and breathed, not crying, just the specific physiological release of a body that had been running on combat readiness for 4 days and had arrived at its first moment of genuine completion. Her hands were shaking slightly. She felt it, acknowledged it, allowed it the 3 minutes it needed before it stopped. When she lifted her face, Tova was sitting beside her. Tova had a cloth pressed to the side of her head where the blood had dried, and she was looking out at the pass mouth where the Shadow Fang force had disappeared with the alert, settled expression she wore when a situation had resolved, but she was still monitoring the edges of it. Neither of them spoke for a while. The pass was very quiet, the kind of quiet that followed the passage of large groups through contained spaces. Not empty quiet, but the specific resonance of a place that had recently held something significant and was absorbing it. "He listened to you," Tova said finally. "Yes. That's not nothing." "No," Elira said. "It's not nothing." She stood, checked her arm where the cut had dried. Not deep, not serious, manageable. She looked at the ridge above where Dara's warriors were beginning their descent, moving with the efficient economical pace of people wrapping an operation that had gone right at considerable cost. "How's your head?" she said to Tova. "Still attached," Tova said. "Mostly. Get Senna to look at it when we're back." "Yes, Counsel." Elira looked at her. Tova was using the title with the deliberate dryness she deployed when she wanted to say something she wasn't going to say out loud. Something like, "I saw that. I know what that cost you. I'm not going to make you talk about it." After 7 months, Elira had learned to receive this particular communication from Tova with the gratitude it deserved. She began the descent. The journey back to the central encampment took 2 full days through weather that was closing in around them. The pass sealing cold arriving ahead of schedule the way northern weather did when it had somewhere to be. She moved through it with her pack and her wolves and her own thinking, which ran slow and thorough the way it did after large events. Not analyzing for strategy anymore, but for the quieter kind of accounting. What had happened, what it meant, what came next. The name she carried was the central question, and the answer to it was not hers to execute. She had sent the evidentiary record. Everything the captured wolf had given her, everything she could reconstruct of the operational timeline, south with a Frostvale courier before she left the pass. Not to Kael, to the 3 council kingdoms whose diplomatic investment in northern recognition gave them both the motive and the authority to examine a destabilization operation on their mutual border. That was the correct instrument. Not personal justice, which was satisfying but limited. Institutional accountability, which was slower but durable. This was one of the things the North had taught her that she had not known she needed to learn. In Shadowfang, she had believed, at some level she had never examined, that the right person with the right information in the right room could resolve most things. What she had found in the Frostvale was that the right person with the right information in the right room was only useful if the room itself was built on something solid. If the structure was compromised, the right person was just another variable being managed by whoever had compromised the structure. You built the room first, then you occupied it. She arrived at the central encampment on the evening of the 2nd day to find Oryx standing at the perimeter as if he had been standing there for some time, which was impossible and also entirely characteristic. He looked at her when she came through the perimeter, at her arm, at her face, at the composure she was wearing and the specific quality of exhaustion underneath it. "It's done," she said. "I know. The courier came yesterday." He turned and walked beside her into the encampment. The council's response will take 2 weeks, possibly 3. That's fast? They've been looking for grounds to move against him for 2 years, Oryx said. You gave them the grounds. He paused. Cleanly, without putting the frost veil in the middle of it. She nodded. The Coldwater Wolves want to go home, he said. The pass is closed for at least 6 weeks, she said. When it opens, I'll go with them and stay through the resettlement. She looked ahead at the encampment fires, small and controlled and permanent-looking in the cold. I told you I'd fix the Eastern supply ratio. He made the sound that was related to a laugh. I know. They walked in silence for a moment. The man in the pass, Oryx said. Not a question, just a door he was leaving open. He's gone, she said. And the other thing. She considered this for 3 steps. Finished, she said. Completely. Oryx nodded once. Good, he said, and meant it in the way that held no unkindness toward whatever the finished thing had been. Just the clean, practical acknowledgement of someone for whom completed grief was a resource recovered. She found Dara at the central fire with 2 of the Western sub-chiefs working through the logistics of the Coldwater resettlement timeline. Dara looked up when she arrived, took in the arm and the face and the bearing, and moved sideways on the bench to make room without commentary. Alira sat down. She sat down at the fire that she had helped build, surrounded by people she had helped build something with, in a territory that was 43 days away from being formally recognized as sovereign for the first time in 4 decades. And she felt the ground beneath her with the specific conscious attention of someone who had been without solid ground for long enough that the sensation of it required deliberate acknowledgement. She had been stripped of everything in a single night and had walked into a wilderness and found, not what she expected to find, but what she was capable of building. The distinction mattered. Expected finds were provisions. They ran out. Built things held. The fire burned low and steady, and she let it warm her face and thought about almost nothing for a while, which was its own kind of luxury. The luxury of people who had done the work and could rest inside it. Tova came and sat on her other side, still had the cloth at her head. Senna was presumably next. The subclan chiefs want a full council session, Tova said. There's debate about the recognition framework signing timeline. Tomorrow, Elira said. They want to know tonight. Tomorrow, Elira said again. And there was something in her voice that was not exhaustion and not authority, but the specific combination of the two that had developed over months of being the person who determined what was urgent and what was not. Tell them counsel is available at first light. Tova absorbed this. You're going to sleep. For approximately 10 hours, Elira said. Yes. She sat at the fire a while longer before she moved to her quarters, long enough to let the warmth settle into her shoulders, long enough to watch the central camp settle into its evening rhythms, the specific domestic peace of a community that had survived another day, intact. Children crossing between structures, 2 elders sharing food near the eastern heating channel, a young warrior sharpening a blade with the inexpert focus of someone still learning the technique. She thought about Kael, moving south through closing passes. She thought about what awaited him, the unraveling of an infiltration that had been running for years, the specific grinding labor of rebuilding trust in every system that had been compromised, the long solitary work of becoming the king he should have been, through methods harder than the ones that had made him the king he was. She did not hope he failed. She did not hope he suffered beyond the measure of what he had caused. She simply placed him in her mind in the correct location, behind her, in the finished place where things went when they were complete. There was a kind of freedom in the placing, not the freedom of indifference. She would never be indifferent to what had happened, but the freedom of someone who had metabolized a wound rather than carried it, who had turned the weight of it into the muscle of something new rather than the scar of something lost. She had not expected this. 7 months ago, standing at the northern gate listening to the iron bolt slide home, she had not imagined freedom. She had imagined survival. They were not the same thing. Survival was the floor. What she had found in the frost veil was everything built on top of it. She thought about what Oryx had said to her in the early weeks. Finish grieving it here, we have work to do. At the time, she had taken it as the practical northern instruction it appeared to be. She understood now that it was also philosophy, the precise and unsentimental truth that the only way through grief was through it, not around it, not under it, not by pretending it was smaller than it was. You felt it completely, and you kept working. The two activities were not in competition. They were the practice. She stood eventually and walked to her quarters. She set down the pack, cleaned the cut on her arm properly, changed her clothes, sat on the edge of her sleeping mat in the firelit quiet of her own space. This room she had accumulated over 7 months, the maps she had made and the records she had kept, and the single personal object on the wall, the knife from her mother that was older than every political arrangement that had ever shaped her life. She looked at it for a long moment. Her mother had been a woman who survived the southern border conflicts of a generation ago, who had raised a daughter in a territory that offered no particular welcome to softness, and had told her once, only once, in the direct Frostvale-adjacent border dialect of her home clan, "You will be all right in the hard places. It's the comfortable ones you need to watch." She had not understood what that meant until she was standing in a comfortable place and it had collapsed beneath her. She understood now. She lay down. Sleep arrived in the specific manner of someone whose body had been owed a debt for 4 days. Fast, absolute, with the quality of something that had been waiting with patient certainty for its moment and saw no reason to hesitate once the moment came. Outside, the central encampment continued its evening in the way that communities continued. Fires checked and banked, perimeter scouts rotating, the 47 Coldwater Wolves bedded in borrowed spaces dreaming of their own settlement 6 weeks away. The recognition framework copy an Oryx stone-walled archive, waiting with the patience of documents that understood their own importance. 300 miles south, Kyle Thorne moved through a closing pass with 90 wolves, and a name that had destroyed the architecture of everything he thought he knew, and the specific quality of a man who had been given a task he had not asked for and would not refuse, because the person who handed it to him had been right about everything she had ever told him, and he was done testing the cost of disbelieving her. The council courier carrying the evidentiary record was 6 hours ahead of him on the southern road, moving fast with the specific urgency of official documents that carried consequences. The world was rearranging itself around a new weight distribution. This was always how it happened, not in the single dramatic moment, but in the sustained, unglamorous work that followed it. The aftermath was always longer and harder and more important than the event, and the people who understood this were the ones who were still standing when it finished. In the central encampment of the Frostvale, under the particular cold of a northern sky that did not dim but only deepened as the night progressed, Elira Vale slept without dreaming. She would be at the council fire at first light. She had work to do. And the ground beneath her feet, for the first time in a very long time, was entirely her own.